let's get into that. What is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the gospel?
There is no other passage in the Hebrew Bible that could be even remotely interpreted to be about messiahs dying for our sins other than Isaiah 53.
From the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy.
That's right. There's nothing more Jewish than believing in Jesus.
What's up, everyone? Thank you for joining us again in the So Be It studio here in the land of Israel. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. William Lane Craig, a leading Christian theologian, philosopher, and apologist known for his expansive knowledge of theology and the evidence for Jesus as Messiah. So about 5 years ago, he had an important conversation with Ben Shapiro. Maybe my time is a little bit off on that, but Ben raised some common Jewish objections to Jesus and his messianic claims. So we want to tackle those. Dr. Craig, thank you so much for being here on So Be It.
Certainly, Jeff. Great to be with you. And I just want to emphasize as strongly as I can my wife and my ardent support for Israel and its current defense against all of the attempts to exterminate it. We pray that Israel will be greatly victorious in its current struggles.
Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot. But in this interview, we're going to explore the challenges that Ben Shapiro made on that show and why Jesus truly is the Messiah, not just a political leader, but the divine Son of God revealed in Scripture. So our goal is to examine the biblical and historical evidence together and understand why Jesus' identity fulfills the promises made throughout the Jewish Scriptures. So with that said, Dr. Craig, let's dive into this discussion. In your interview with Ben Shapiro, whom I love, I think he's a great moral and intellectual influence in today's society. You get into around a 12-minute discussion with him about Jesus as Messiah, and I found his responses to the messianic claims a bit lacking, which is why I wanted to address them one by one here. And it was great because when I saw you on there, I said, oh, Ben's going to get it now. I'm wondering how he's going to respond to these. So I'm going to roll the first objection, which is prove Jesus was who he said he is in the Gospels.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
So what is the proof that Jesus says who he says he is in the Gospels, Dr. Craig?
What I argued was that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing expectations of a political ruler and earthly king. The constellation of claims that Jesus made about himself to be the Messiah, the Son of God in a unique sense, and in particular, the Son of Man prophesied in Daniel chapter 7 were considered blasphemous in Jewish ears because they implied divine prerogatives. So I do think that Jesus asserted a divine status for himself. And the proof of these claims is his resurrection from the dead. God's raising Jesus from the dead is decisive, public, vindication by the God of Israel, allegedly blasphemed by Jesus, that his claims were in fact true and that therefore he was who he claimed to be.
You mentioned Daniel 7, verses 13 through 14. When we look at that passage, the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven, receiving eternal dominion, glory, and kingdom. And that's imagery reserved for God alone in Jewish thought. And I wanted to make another point here in Psalm 104, verse 3, which makes that connection even clearer. He says about God that he lays the beams of his chambers on the water. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. And in biblical tradition, riding on the clouds is a divine prerogative. When Jesus stands before the high priest and says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, which you mentioned in the interview with Ben, and coming with the clouds of heaven, it's no surprise that the high priests tore their garments and accused him of blasphemy. So we also see this divine messianic concept hinted at elsewhere. In Isaiah 9:6, which calls the Messiah child El Gibor, which is mighty God, and Aviad, which is everlasting Father. We have Micah 5:2, which speaks of a ruler from Bethlehem who's going forth from eternity, and which in Hebrew, it says eternity. And even Rashi, one of the most studied Jewish commentators, a medieval rabbi, identifies this as messianic prophecy. And yet, as Ben's comment reflects, many see this idea of a divine Messiah as foreign to Judaism. So my question for you is, would you say that these passages from the Hebrew Bible, Daniel 7, Psalm 104, Isaiah 9, Micah 5, suggest that a divine Messiah was a possible or even expected category in Second Temple Jewish thought, or did Jesus introduce something entirely new to the Jewish messianic imagination?
The passages you cited do give grounds for seeing the Messiah and the promised one to Israel to having a divine status. And I think that's particularly clear with respect to the Son of Man. I think that's the most dramatic divine title claimed by Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
And in that trial scene in Mark that you cited, many New Testament scholars think that when Jesus said, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven," that the word there for the power is a euphemism for the divine name, and that what Jesus actually did was to pronounce the divine name, which would be blasphemous in Jewish ears. So it does seem that Jesus was making superhuman divine claims for himself that were at least foreshadowed in the Hebrew Bible.
It's interesting, too, that in John 10:33, when the religious leaders want to stone Jesus, they said it's not for any good work, but because you, being a man, make yourself God. And that reaction implies that they understood his claims as far more than political or prophetic. My next question for you, Dr. Craig, is how do you read this scene in John 10 in light of the charge of blasphemy at his trial? Do you see it as a consistent pattern in the way Jesus' self-understanding provoked those around him, not merely for claiming messiahship, but for implying equality with God?
That does seem to be a consistent emphasis in the Gospels. You have that example in John 10 and Jesus' statement, "Before Abraham was, I am." And then you have in Mark chapter 2, where the Pharisees say, "This man is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?"
Right.
And Jesus says that you may know that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins. He then heals the paralytic man. So over and over again in the Gospels, you see Jesus arrogating to himself divine prerogatives that no human being could claim without blasphemy.
So let's roll Ben's second objection, which is the resurrection is not proof of divinity.
From the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense. Even there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that'd be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
It was clear, though, when the chief priest tore his robes. I mean,
Yes.
if someone was just claiming to be Messiah, that's not, and as Ben said in the episode, that's not a punishable claim.
Well, I think that the Bar Kokhba example serves to reinforce the point that I was trying to make. People rejected Bar Kokhba's messianic claims when he failed to live up to their expectations, in the same way that Jesus was rejected when he failed to live up to their political and earthly expectations. The difference between the two was Jesus' resurrection from the dead. It was Christ being raised from the dead that vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified, and that sets him apart from these other failed messianic claimants who were a dime a dozen during the first century before Christ and after Christ.
Even some later Jewish mystical literature like the Zohar even refers to the Messiah as possessing a concealed divine nature, which hints at a Messiah carrying divine qualities, though concealed. So, these later mystical Jewish traditions reflect an undercurrent of ancient expectations that perhaps hadn't disappeared entirely and might help inform Jewish Christian conversations about the identity of Messiah today. So
yes, it's possible. Those rabbinic sources may come too late to be of much help in understanding Second Temple Judaism in the context in which Jesus taught and ministered. That would be my concern about appealing to those for an understanding of the historical Jesus, at least.
Absolutely, and that's a great point that you make. And so the point I make by bringing these up is that it's not inconsistent with Jewish thought, Second Temple period and forward, regarding the messiahship of someone that would come and not just rule politically, but also be the spiritual Messiah, the one that would reconcile us to God, that Jesus would portray. I'm not actually agreeing with the rabbinic commentary, but to bring those up, it actually shows that it was within the Jewish mindset that Ben was rejecting. So let me roll the next one.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
All right, so that's a shorty. So why is resurrection proof of divinity? Lazarus was resurrected. You had a great response to this.
Yeah, it seems to me that the question here concerns why should Jesus be regarded as divine rather than Lazarus, since both of them rose from the dead? Why take those messianic passages in the Hebrew Bible to apply to Jesus rather than to Lazarus? Well, it seems to me that the answer is clearly to be found in the religio-historical context in which Jesus' resurrection occurred, namely his own unparalleled life and personal claims. Lazarus had made no such claims. Indeed, Lazarus was raised through Jesus' power and authority. And therefore, Jesus' resurrection from the dead sets him apart as God's special messenger and divine revelation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to add some background to that also from Jewish tradition. And the reason I bring up these Jewish traditions, Dr. Craig, is because when someone says, or a religious Jew says, that this has nothing to do with Judaism, our rabbis and our sages, they would never have accepted this kind of thing. It would be foreign to them. And so I bring these up just to say that actually within rabbinic literature and rabbinic commentary, they do make room for this kind of figure. So I want to share some background from the Jewish tradition that shows this fits within Jewish messianic thought. So Isaiah 53, that's from the Tanakh itself. It's foundational. It talks about a suffering servant who dies. But then in verse 10, in Isaiah 53, it says, God will prolong his days, which implies
Yes.
resurrection, or at least vindication, which you like to talk about after death. And while some rabbis like Rashi, like I said before, says this servant is Israel, earlier Midrashic interpretations actually applied it to the Messiah. So, Dr. Craig, could you elaborate on how the suffering servant imagery in Isaiah 53 shapes Jewish expectations of the Messiah and how this might help us understand the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection?
I think, Jeff, the more important question is how Isaiah 53 shaped the early Christians' understanding of Jesus and who he was. When you read the New Testament, you find an Isaianic theology from Isaiah 53 constantly repeated throughout the books of the New Testament. The primitive Christians clearly identified that suffering servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53 with Jesus of Nazareth. And not only is this explicit in certain passages, but it's also implicit in many others where there are allusions to Isaiah 53. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, Paul says that I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, namely that Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Now, when he says this is in accordance with the scriptures, what passages in the Hebrew Bible could he possibly be thinking of? There is no other passage in the Hebrew Bible that could be even remotely interpreted to be about Messiah's dying for our sins other than Isaiah 53. And in that passage, it describes the vicarious, substitutional punishment of the servant of the Lord for the sins of the people. He bore our punishments in his body. And as you say, the resurrection is intimated in that passage in saying that God will prolong his days. He will see his progeny. And so, while not clearly predicted, I think that the resurrection can certainly, in retrospect, be read as intimated in that passage. And I think that the early Christians did so read Isaiah 53.
You know, Ben made a point to say that the Messiah is really only a political figure. And even in Jewish literature, in an early rabbinic homiletical text, the Messiah is depicted as suffering for Israel's sins. And it clearly presents the Messiah's suffering. Even more directly, in the Talmud, it talks about the Messiah, son of Joseph, which is another figure. I like to say when I'm talking to people on the streets that even religious Judaism has room for two Messiahs, because they have to fit those contrasting accounts of the Messiah that will suffer and die, and then the other one that will rule and reign. And so in the Talmud, it talks about the Messiah, son of Joseph, who suffers and dies before the final redemption. And the concept of his resurrection is found later also in Jewish mystical literature, such as the Zohar. So this shows that within Jewish midrashim and mystical writings, there is room for a suffering, even dying Messiah who will rise again, which is another motif consistent with messianic hope. So
yeah, that's very interesting.
The biggest comments that I get on the streets, and maybe you've experienced as well from religious Jews, is that these concepts are so unrelated to Judaism today, and it's always been that way from the beginning, which is one of the claims that Ben made. And I just like to give light to the fact that it hasn't always been that way, and that Second Temple Judaism is very different than the Judaism that we see today.
My take on this is that there really isn't any problem in Jesus having a radically different idea of the Messiah than what the prevailing expectation was.
Yeah.
If one can show in these later rabbinical writings that there's room within Judaism for such a conception, well and good. That's all for the better. But even given the fact that there was no precedence for the kind of person or Messiah Jesus claimed to be, you still have got to explain, first of all, this man's unparalleled life and teachings, and then the evidence of his resurrection from the dead. That was what made the difference for these early Jewish followers of Jesus. They believed that the God of Israel, who had been allegedly blasphemed by Jesus, had raised him from the dead, thereby vindicating his claims and showing that he was exactly who he claimed to be. So let's not minimize the possibility of Jesus offering something creative and radically different, radically new, because there is good historical evidence in support of the truth of those claims, however unanticipated or unexpected they might have been.
Yeah, another argument that I get regularly is that, well, the Jews rejected Jesus, and I often say, well, then I guess you can't believe in Jeremiah or Isaiah, or all the prophets were rejected as well, because they would challenge the status and the current mindset of the local and cultural time period.
Yeah, what we've got to do is always come back to the question, then who was Jesus? Who was this man that has been the most famous Jewish person in history? Ben Shapiro is reduced to trying to explain Jesus away as a political revolutionary, which is utterly implausible and has no credible scholarly support today. So, however unexpected, however radically new Jesus and his claims may have been, you've got to answer the question, then who do you think this man was? And I think in light of the facts of the empty tomb, the postmortem appearances of Jesus, and the transformation in these earliest Jewish disciples, the best explanation is that he was who he claimed to be, and that God has done something remarkably new and world-changing in the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, well, it definitely was world-changing, and his disciples were willing to die based on what they had seen take place in the resurrection of Jesus. So I want to go on to the next objection, which I think is going to be the most fun and easiest one to refute, actually, which was the time gap between the events and the recorded testimony of Jesus. So let me roll that.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations.
So I love this clip, because when I heard it for the first time, I thought to myself, something's really off here. But I want first, and I'll bring it up in a bit, but I want to hear first what you have to say regarding that time gap and the reliability of the Gospels as historical documents compared to other ancient texts.
Yes, even considering a time gap of 40 years between the crucifixion of Jesus and the date of the earliest gospel that Ben gives at AD 70, that would be a remarkably short time compared to the time gap that normally exists in ancient history between events and the first records of those events. For example, the earliest biographies that we have of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians regard these as largely accurate accounts of the life of Alexander. This gap of 40 years that Ben talks about is incredibly narrow, because the living eyewitnesses were still about at that time. The apostles were still alive, who were the trustees of the Jesus tradition for handing it on. But the situation is actually much more significant than that, because what Ben doesn't recognize or take account of is that the Gospels and the letters of Paul are based upon traditions that go back even earlier to within a few years after the events themselves. And the example I gave in the clip was 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, where Paul cites a tradition summarizing the death and burial and resurrection and appearances of Jesus that goes back to within probably the first 5 years after the crucifixion. And therefore, it simply becomes idle to speak of legends in a case like that. You are dealing with oral history.
Absolutely. That's an amazing point that you just made, because, the early dating of Paul's letters is really important. But from a Jewish perspective, we have strong parallels for trusting oral traditions. I mean, we're like an oral tradition religion and faith over long periods. I mean, if you take the oral Torah, for example, I mean, Ben himself relies on it. It was only written down in the Mishnah around 200 AD, and the Talmud, which is a key Jewish text of law and tradition, made up of the Mishnah and its commentary, that was codified and written down between 500 and 600 AD, and that's over 1600 to 1900 years after it was given to Moses. So, yet despite this massive, huge gap, Jewish tradition regards the oral Torah as authoritative and reliable. So how does this Jewish example of preserving oral tradition for centuries influence how we view the reliability of early Christian documents like the Gospels?
Your point is not simply an ad hominem argument against Ben Shapiro, that he's inconsistent in accepting oral Torah but rejecting the Gospels. Rather, your point is an even more important one, and that is that it is relevant to the historicity of the Gospels to consider the care with which Jewish people treated sacred tradition.
Right.
And you are absolutely right in saying that the skills to memorize great lengths of oral tradition and pass them on, word perfect, was highly prized. It was developed in the synagogue and in the elementary schools. And it is plausible to think that the apostles would have similarly been very careful to preserve the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So in 1 Corinthians 15, the passage that I alluded to a moment ago, where Paul summarizes the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus, he uses the technical terms for the Jewish transmission of sacred tradition. He says, I handed on to you what I also had received. And then he quotes this oral tradition summarizing the passion and resurrection of Jesus. So your point is a good one, and it is definitely relevant to the reliability of the oral traditions underlying the four Gospels.
If Jewish tradition can trust oral histories recorded centuries later, then it makes sense that early first century documents like the Gospels, which were written much, much closer, and even some of the epistles, even within 5 to 15 years, is that what you said?
Yes, within 5 years, the traditions that Paul quoted that I just mentioned.
Yeah, so I mean, we can say with that's evidence that the Gospels hold really strong historical credibility.
And I think too, as well, Jeff, the so-called pre-Markan Passion story, that is to say, the source that Mark used in writing his gospel, also goes back to within the first decade after Jesus' death. So these are incredibly early sources, and they are independent of one another, so that you have multiple early independent attestation of the events of Jesus' passion and crucifixion. And that is one of the most important criteria that historians use in assessing the historical credibility of ancient narratives.
Wow. Yeah. And we can't forget that the disciples were being, the early followers of Jesus, which were mostly all Jewish, were being persecuted as well. Why didn't they
Exactly.
write it down, right away? Well, they were being martyred for their faith. So lastly, I want to go on to the fourth and final objection here. He said that other Jewish sects have claimed dead leaders as messiahs. Take the example of the Lubavitcher Rebbe from Chabad. Even years after his death, many still treat him as the Messiah, but claims of his resurrection in those cases aren't considered proof.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right, the Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s,
Yes.
and there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death. That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experience it. Right. So especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben.
So yes, the other Jewish sects have claimed dead leaders, messiahs. Take example the Lubavitcher Rebbe from Chabad, and after years after his death, many still treat him as the Messiah. But claims of resurrection in those cases aren't considered proof. That's what Ben's saying. So how does Jesus' resurrection differ from those later messianic claims like the Lubavitcher Rebbe?
It seems to me, Jeff, unless I'm misunderstanding the situation, they're not analogous at all.
Right.
The point here is that Jesus' followers did not believe him to be the Messiah despite his death, as in the case of Rabbi Schneerson. So the two cases are actually in radical contrast to each other. In the one case, the Jewish followers of Rabbi Schneerson believed in his messiahship despite his death. In the case of Jesus of Nazareth, faced with his crucifixion and death, this was destructive of their belief in his messiahship. It was his resurrection from the dead that convinced them that he was the Messiah after all. So in Jesus' case, they believed that he was the Messiah because he had been raised from the dead. And I think that this helps to put the proper focus back on the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' faith in his resurrection. How will the person who does not believe in Jesus' resurrection explain away these facts?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I actually like to say as well, what came to mind when you were talking was that the Chabad Jews believed that Rabbi Schneerson was supposed to rise from the dead. And I'm thinking, well, where did they get this idea from? If not from Jewish literature, and not for the expectation of a dying and rising Messiah. So,
do you think it was perhaps due to Christian influence that they wanted to have a competitor to Jesus?
Well, I think that's a really smart question, because as we look at rabbinic literature and the Talmud being codified and written in the 4th and 5th century AD, you could even say that the Talmud is a reaction to Messianic Judaism or Christianity itself.
Yes.
And so it's almost like playing catch up. So the next question I have for you is, how significant is the fact that Jesus' resurrection was proclaimed publicly in Jerusalem, a place where the truth of the tomb's status could easily be checked?
That's so important. The belief in Jesus' resurrection did not depend merely upon private experiences like the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, but there was a publicly inspectable fact, namely the empty tomb of Jesus.
Right.
The vast majority of historical scholars today who have written on the subject think that the account of Jesus' burial in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea is historical, that this is actually how the body of Jesus was interred after his crucifixion. And therefore, the site of Jesus' burial was known in Jerusalem to both Jew and Christian alike. And so when the disciples began to proclaim God raised him from the dead, the empty tomb was a publicly inspectable fact in Jerusalem that could not be denied.
Right.
And that, I think, is very powerful testimony to the credibility of what the disciples were saying.
Absolutely. And it contrasts starkly with the Lubavitcher situation, where no such public verification or challenge occurred, you know. So what does it mean for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection that was proclaimed openly before hostile Jewish and Roman authorities who had every interest in disproving it?
It seems to me that the fact that the earliest followers of Jesus were willing to publicly proclaim his resurrection in the face of terrible threats and persecution, and in a few cases, even martyrdom, shows that they were sincere in what they were proclaiming, that these men were firmly convinced that God had, in fact, raised Jesus from the dead. And that's why the old conspiracy theory of 17th century deism, which held that the disciples stole the body and made up the resurrection appearances, would be defended by no contemporary historical scholar. It is evident from their willingness to stand in the face of danger and to proclaim unflinchingly the truth of Jesus' resurrection, shows that these early disciples sincerely believed in the truth of what they proclaimed. And so the question will be then is, how could they come to such a belief? What in the world would have led these Jewish followers of a failed Messiah to believe that, contrary to Jewish expectations and beliefs, he was risen from the dead? And that is a hole in the middle of first century history that any historian who wants to account for the origin of the Christian movement has got to plug up.
For real. And your arguments are so compelling, which blew my mind when Ben wrapped it up by saying he found your arguments rather uninteresting. I don't know if you remember that part. You know, he says, well, I kind of find these arguments kind of, you know, we can go back and forth, and I kind of find it uninteresting. And I mean, look.
I must say, I was rather taken aback.
I could tell
by the whole episode, because when I came on the program, my impression was the idea that we would talk about matters about which we agreed as a Jew and a Christian, and not get into these controversial matters. And then he sprang on me these questions. And as I think, as you say, Jeff, at the end of the day, he beat a rather hasty retreat.
Yeah, I mean, you looked unbelievably prepared, because when I watched through that clip, I thought, well, it seems like you were prepared for those specific questions, but apparently it was a sneak attack. But you know, he's sharp. You know, he's quick-witted, and he tackles a lot of big topics head on. But honestly, I felt it was a bit of a dodge. We're not talking about some, you know, light surface level stuff here that's, you know, just dismissible. But you know, these are ancient Jewish messianic expectations, rabbinic commentaries, historical claims, and these have been wrestled with for centuries, and there are arguments from within Judaism about these things. I mean, yeah,
that's right. There's nothing more Jewish than believing in Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth was the most famous Jew in history. All of his disciples were Jewish. You couldn't do anything more Jewish than to be a follower of Jesus. And so I hope that your listeners will be open-minded about this and ask themselves whether or not the God of Israel has done something here marvelous and unexpected, and what a tragedy it would be to miss it.
Yeah, Yeah, what a great point. I mean, one of the things that people say when Jewish people come to faith in Jesus, and this is what I said as well when he freed me from decades of spiritual torment and depression and suicidal thoughts, and I was freed in one day. I mean, my hands went up and I said, I'm free, and I knew that, and immediately I said, there is nothing more Jewish than believing in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, and I would have never said that prior, never said that.
Wow.
But by conviction of the Holy Spirit. And so that was just an incredible thing, which basically led me to what I'm doing today. So I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Craig, for this insightful conversation. It's refreshing to go beyond quick sound bites, like those from Ben, who often make surface level claims against Jesus as Messiah. And from a Messianic Jewish perspective, Jesus' resurrection fits perfectly within the Jewish hope of a suffering Messiah who's ultimately vindicated. His first followers were devout Jews willing to die for their faith because they saw this fulfillment firsthand. Jewish texts like Isaiah and the Midrash, the Talmud, and the mystical Zohar, they allow for a Messiah who suffers and rises again, just as Jesus did. And the New Testament, written by Jewish authors for Jewish audiences, shows how Jesus fulfilled these ancient promises, making the message deeply rooted in Jewish traditions. Yeah. So to explore more, check out Dr. William Lane Craig's work at reasonablefaith.org and his popular books like Reasonable Faith, On Guard, and The Sun Rises. Dr. Craig, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's been great to have this conversation with you, Jeff, and may God bless your work and God bless Israel.